Today, Trump posted a Truth Social message that crossed a line that no American president has publicly crossed in this war. Let me read it to you directly, because the specific language matters more than any summary. Great progress has been made, but, if for any reason, a deal is not shortly reached, which it probably will be, and if the Hormuz Strait is not immediately open for business, we will conclude our lovely stay in Iran by blowing up and completely obliterating all of their electric generating plants, oil wells, and Kharg Island, and possibly all desalination plants, which we have purposefully not yet touched. This will be in retribution for our many soldiers and others that Iran has butchered and killed over the old regime's 47-year reign of terror. That post went up this morning. Brent crude crossed $116 a barrel within hours. That is the highest price since this war began. And it is up more than 60% from the approximately $70 a barrel price before February 28th. There are 5 distinct things in that post that need to be examined separately because they each carry different weight. First, the desalination plant threat. Trump added the parenthetical, possibly all desalination plants, as though it were an afterthought. It is not. Desalination plants are the primary drinking water source for millions of people in Iran, particularly in the southern coastal regions. Striking all of Iran's desalination plants would constitute, in the plain language of international humanitarian law, collective punishment of a civilian population. Radwa Ramadan, a legal expert quoted by Al Jazeera today, stated directly, threatening to obliterate a nation's power grid, oil infrastructure, and water supply to coerce its government is not a negotiating tactic. It is textbook collective punishment and a war crime. This is not a fringe legal opinion. It reflects the established framework of international humanitarian law under the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. The ICRC has noted repeatedly during this war that civilian infrastructure, water, electricity, food systems, cannot be lawfully targeted to coerce a government. Trump's threat to possibly destroy all of Iran's desalination plants is the first time in this conflict that the U.S. president has publicly included water supply in a list of military targets. This is not simply an escalation in rhetoric. It is the public articulation of a strategy that, if executed, would produce a humanitarian crisis of historic proportions among a civilian population that already has extremely limited natural freshwater access. Second, Kharg Island and the oil. Trump told the Financial Times on Sunday that his preference would be to take the oil in Iran. He compared the potential move explicitly to Venezuela, where the U.S. forcibly removed President Nicolas Maduro and intends to control Venezuela's oil industry. He said, "To be honest with you, my favorite thing is to take the oil in Iran, but some stupid people back in the U.S. say, 'Why are you doing that?' But they're stupid people." He added, "Maybe we take Kharg Island, maybe we don't. We have a lot of options. It would also mean we had to be there for a while." Kharg Island handles approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. It has a loading capacity of roughly 7 million barrels per day. If the U.S. seized Kharg Island, it would not simply be a military operation. It would be the largest act of resource expropriation by an American government in modern history. It would require a sustained ground presence. Trump himself acknowledged it would mean staying for a while. It would trigger Iranian retaliation against every Gulf state oil facility in range. JPMorgan analysts this week said that if Kharg Island's export infrastructure were destroyed or seized, the loss of Iran's storage buffer and export capacity would mean as much as half of Iran's 3.3 million barrel per day national production could be at risk, with effects cascading immediately into global supply. Goldman Sachs, in analysis from this week, projected that if the war stretched another 5 to 6 weeks, Qatar and other GCC countries could see GDP contractions of up to 14%. Trita Parsi, an Iran analyst, noted that Asian countries are far more vulnerable than the U.S. to the consequences of Iranian retaliation against GCC oil infrastructure, and that a Kharg Island seizure would almost certainly trigger exactly that. Third, a new and more reasonable regime. This phrase, from Trump's Truth Social post this morning, is the most diplomatically significant language he has used in this entire war. He wrote, "The United States of America is in serious discussions with a new and more reasonable regime to end our military operations in Iran." Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson, Esmail Baghaei, responded within hours. Iran has not had any direct negotiations with the U.S. What has been discussed are messages received through intermediaries. Iran denied the existence of a new regime. The current government, President Pezeshkian, Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, the parliament, remains in place and functioning. There has been no regime change. There is no new leadership that has replaced the existing one. So what does Trump mean by new and more reasonable regime? Two interpretations are plausible. One, Trump is referring to the fact that Mojtaba Khamenei has replaced his father, Ali Khamenei, who was killed on February 28th. The younger Khamenei could be characterized as a new leader, even though he heads the same institutional system. Two, Trump is referring to internal shifts in Iran's negotiating posture, perhaps signals from figures like Parliament Speaker Ghalibaf or Foreign Minister Araghchi that are being read by the U.S. side as constituting a different approach from the pre-war era. Either interpretation carries profound consequences. If Trump is publicly characterizing Mojtaba Khamenei as representing a new and more reasonable regime, he is implicitly signaling that the goal of regime change has been softened or abandoned, that the new supreme leader is an acceptable interlocutor rather than a target. That would be a major shift from the stated war objective of creating conditions for regime change that both Netanyahu and multiple U.S. officials have articulated. And it would explain why Reza Pahlavi's CPAC speech yesterday, explicitly opposing any deal that leaves elements of the regime in place, was received so enthusiastically by the American hawkish right. Pahlavi's audience understood that Trump's new regime language represents exactly the kind of partial settlement they are trying to prevent. Fourth, Spain closing its airspace. Spain's government announced this morning that it had closed its airspace to U.S. military aircraft involved in attacks against Iran. This is an extraordinary act. Spain is a NATO member and a U.S. treaty ally. Closing national airspace to allied military operations is among the most serious diplomatic steps a NATO country can take short of formal withdrawal from the alliance's integrated command. Spain had already described the U.S.-Israeli campaign as an unjust and illegal war, words delivered by Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez in the Spanish Congress last week. The airspace closure is the operational follow-through on that political judgment. The practical military effect on U.S. operations is limited, as Spain's geographic position is far from the active war zone. But the symbolic and diplomatic effect is enormous. When a NATO ally formally bars American military aircraft from its airspace during an active American military operation, it signals the depth of the fracture between the U.S. and its Western partners. Every other NATO government is now watching to see whether there are consequences for Spain's decision and whether other governments might follow. Germany's Chancellor Merz, France's foreign policy, and now Spain's airspace closure form a visible arc of European descent that is hardening in real time. Fifth, the oil price number itself. Brent crude at $160 a barrel is not just an energy market indicator. It is a political number with specific domestic consequences for the Trump administration. U.S. gasoline prices have risen by more than $1 per gallon since February 28th, a larger 30-day increase than followed Hurricane Katrina in 2005 or the Russia-Ukraine sanctions of 2022. The post-Ukraine sanctions increase eventually peaked at a record 5.02 per gallon. Analysts are warning that, with 116 oil, the trajectory toward 5.02 or higher is plausible if the strait remains closed and the war escalates into oil infrastructure. Gas prices are the most politically salient economic indicator for American voters. They are visible, daily, unavoidable. They appear on every roadside sign. And they are rising because of a war that 59% of Americans, according to the Pew Research Center poll from March, believe the U.S. made the wrong decision to start. The domestic political arithmetic is this: the higher oil goes, the more Trump needs to show either a deal or a decisive military victory. He cannot sustain $5 gasoline going into the 2026 midterms without one or the other. Today's Truth Social post, threatening to obliterate everything while claiming great progress in talks, is the rhetorical equivalent of holding both options open simultaneously. It is a negotiating posture that tries to create maximum pressure on Iran while reassuring the American public that a deal is near. The problem is that this posture is now 31 days old, and neither the deal nor the decisive victory has materialized. On the battlefield today, Israel launched what the IDF described as widespread strikes across Tehran, including in the Saadabad residential neighborhood, and targeting what it said were ballistic missile production facilities. Iran struck Haifa's Bazan oil refinery for a second time, causing a fire. Sirens sounded near Israel's nuclear research center. In Lebanon, an Indonesian UN peacekeeper was killed by Israeli fire on Sunday, prompting formal condemnation from Jakarta. The Lebanese army confirmed a Lebanese soldier was killed at a checkpoint by Israeli fire on Monday. Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu ordered expansion of the security buffer zone in southern Lebanon toward the Litani River. In the Gulf, a Kuwaiti power and desalination plant was attacked overnight, killing an Indian worker, the latest in a series of attacks on Gulf water infrastructure that have been systematically growing in frequency. Iran's response to the 15-point U.S. plan arrived through state media today. Iranian officials called the proposals largely excessive, unrealistic, and unreasonable. This directly contradicts Trump's claim that Iran has agreed to most of the 15-point list. The gap between Trump's description of the negotiations and Iran's public characterization of them is now so wide that it can no longer be explained by diplomatic discretion or strategic ambiguity. Either Trump is receiving inaccurate reports about what Iran has agreed to, or Trump is publicly mischaracterizing the state of talks for domestic political effect, or Iran is saying one thing through intermediaries and another thing publicly. Based on the documented pattern of the last 10 days, repeated Iranian public denials of every American claim of progress, the most parsimonious explanation is a combination of the second and third. A senior Iranian security official told CNN today, "This is our war, and we will not stop defending until we teach Trump and Netanyahu a historic lesson." That is not the language of a party that has agreed to most of a 15-point ceasefire demand list. The former U.S. Special Operations Chief of Staff, Seth Crumrich, speaking on CNBC today, said, "We're probably closer to the beginning or to the middle of this story than we are to the end." That is the most honest assessment from a U.S. security professional about where this war actually is at day 31. Not at the end, not near the end. Somewhere in the middle, with oil at $116, Spain's airspace closed, Iran's water supply in Trump's threat list, and a Kharg Island invasion that requires ground troops hovering at the edge of every policy discussion. The April 6th deadline, the date Trump set for Iran to open the strait or face obliteration of its energy infrastructure, is 1 week away. Every piece of evidence from the last 31 days suggests that deadline will either be extended again or that the consequences Trump has threatened will begin to be executed. If extended, Trump absorbs another credibility cost in a war where each unfulfilled ultimatum has already damaged his domestic political position and his diplomatic standing with allies. If executed, if the U.S. actually destroys Iran's power plants, oil wells, and desalination infrastructure, it will trigger an Iranian response the scale of which has not yet been seen in this war, send oil beyond $150 a barrel, and produce a humanitarian catastrophe that will define this presidency for decades. Those are the two paths. Neither is clean, neither is cost-free, and the choice between them will be made in the next 7 days. There is one final development from today that deserves to be named directly, because it did not make many headlines, but it encapsulates the full absurdity of where this war has landed. Trump, in the same Truth Social post threatening to obliterate Iran's desalination plants, wrote that these are facilities the U.S. has purposefully not yet touched. That parenthetical, purposefully not yet touched, is extraordinary. It reveals that the restraint so far has been a deliberate choice, held in reserve as leverage. It implies the U.S. has had the capability to destroy Iran's water infrastructure from the beginning and has chosen not to. This is Trump telling Iran, "We have been merciful. We are now withdrawing that mercy as a threat." The international law implications are straightforward. You cannot make a lawful threat to commit a war crime as a negotiating tactic. The mere public threat to target civilian water infrastructure is, under the Rome Statute and the Geneva Conventions, legally problematic regardless of whether the strikes are ever carried out. Multiple human rights organizations and UN officials have noted this publicly. The ICRC has commented. Al Jazeera's legal analysts have commented. The Irish Times, covering the story this morning from Dublin, noted the same. None of it will change Trump's posting behavior, but all of it creates a permanent legal and historical record. Meanwhile, oil at $160 means American consumers are paying the price of this war at the pump, at the grocery store, through fertilizer costs, and in their energy bills. The war that was supposed to be over in 4 to 6 weeks is entering its 5th week with a higher oil price than any moment in the preceding 4 weeks. The financial cost, the human cost, the diplomatic cost, and the legal cost are all compounding simultaneously. 7 days to April 6th. The clock is running. I will see you in the next one.